We got a readout of Joe Biden's earlier phone call with Benjamin Netanyahu. The White House says they discussed how to use this moment to bring the hostages home and to bring the war to a close. Does this killing today make that more likely?
Thank you so much. I think, as we heard from Jane Harman, what's considerable is that the international community and the United States are very eager to see the conflict in the region come to an end, not just between Israel and Gaza, but between Israel and Hezbollah, and to see a de-escalation between Israel and Iran. The problem is that the international community can't want this more than the parties. And so while what we saw today was a considerable victory for the Israelis, and specifically for Netanyahu, one of their key strategic objectives in Gaza was to eliminate the leadership, and they have now taken out really the trifecta of Hamas leaders, and Sinwar was perhaps the most important because he, of course, was the mastermind behind the 10/7 massacre. This is a significant victory for Israel, and yet still so many other objectives remain unachieved, and that includes the release of more than 100 hostages and the disarmament of Hamas. Until both of those things happen, I can't see a scenario where the Israelis are going to move to any meaningful ceasefire. And of course, Hamas, reconstituted, would need to be in a position to do that as well.
Yeah, I guess it becomes a question here as they describe this as a decapitation. Carmel, how many heads there are on this Hydra? Who is likely to take over in Sinwar's stead?
Yeah, so what we see right now is kind of a moment where Hamas has really been, as you've said, kind of beheaded here. There are two prospective candidates to take over the leadership. One is Sinwar's brother, Mohammed Sinwar, his younger brother, who's seen as more of a more localized militia leader. The other, of course, is Hamas leadership in Qatar, where what you have is leadership that tends to be a little bit more moderate, that has acted as kind of the political spokesperson overseas, but doesn't necessarily have the same degree of domestic support. So what we're likely to see is some infighting within Hamas as they determine what their leadership is going to look like moving forward. And then the question becomes whether or not Hamas, now hobbled by what has happened, is motivated to concede to Israel, release the hostages, or the very opposite. You know, the way that Sinwar was killed really he will be martyred. He will be seen as someone who was on the front lines of the war. It could actually help Hamas to recruit new fighters in a moment where folks have become pretty disillusioned with Hamas.
I mentioned the readout from the White House, Carmel, earlier today. We also heard from Jake Sullivan, the president's national security advisor, who was aboard Air Force One with Joe Biden when this all broke. This is what he had to say about the news of Sinwar's death and the future of the war in Gaza.
Various points along the way, Sinwar was more interested in causing mayhem and chaos and death than in actually trying to achieve a ceasefire and hostage deal. And we repeatedly saw moments where it was him in particular who stood in the way of making progress towards a ceasefire and hostage deal. Now, there were other obstacles too along the way, but he was certainly a critical one. And yes, I think his removal from the battlefield does present an opportunity to find a way forward that gets the hostages home.
Keep hearing the word opportunity in this case, Carmel. What do people think on the streets of Israel, Jerusalem, and throughout Tel Aviv?
Yeah, there is certainly an opportunity. There is an off-ramp here for Israeli leadership should they choose to take it. Let's be very clear. There is a reason now to call for a ceasefire. That being said, again, you still have to have both actors at the table. It can't be done unilaterally. I think the other piece that you have is the continued political pressure on Netanyahu to continue in the operation in Gaza. And I think it's also important to remember that just because there's a ceasefire doesn't mean Israel's operations in Gaza are going to cease entirely. So those are two totally different things. On the other hand, for there to be a ceasefire, it would mean that Netanyahu would essentially say that this conflict has ended. And that would require him to essentially face up to the music. There will be an investigation into how the deadliest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust happened under Netanyahu's watch. That's something he's very eager to avoid. There's also a huge amount of pressure from Israel's right-wing coalition, not just to establish a security corridor in Gaza, but also to establish settlements. That's something that's still a little bit far-fetched, but the objectives are considerable, and the obstacles to taking advantage of the opportunity are certainly significant.
Carmel, before we got this news, the news pertaining to Gaza that we were most interested in the last few days was the U.S. effectively warning Israel if the humanitarian situation does not improve soon, they were going to start withholding arms. I wonder if you ever believed that to be a real threat and how the nature of that might change in the aftermath of Sinwar's death.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily expect Sinwar's death to change the dynamics here between the U.S. and Israel when it comes to the humanitarian situation.
But that being said, Carmel, if I could just jump in, I guess what I'm wondering here is if the U.S. was supporting Israel in its objectives, and one of the objectives was to take out the leadership, which they have now successfully done. Is that going to make the U.S. even less patient with Israel's ongoing operations?
Look, the U.S. is deeply committed to achieving a resolution to this conflict, and that is not going to change. They are also eager, of course, to see some kind of a ceasefire before the election. There are political considerations here, but they also want to see an end to the humanitarian crisis and killing that is happening in Gaza. They want to see the release of hostages. But the U.S. is not going to force Israel into a unilateral ceasefire that doesn't include the release of those hostages. So then the question is, what concessions is it going to push Israel to make? I think we're going to see tensions that are going to continue between the two parties. Netanyahu, of course, is got his eye on the elections, is very disinclined to make a deal with a lame duck president. He wants to see who wins in November, and he is likely to continue to drag his feet. We'll see the tensions here, but there's a lot of different factors that are also keeping the two parties close. Let's not forget how the U.S. has responded with respect to the Iranian attacks and helping Israel to prepare to respond as well.
Of course, Hamas is one of 3 Iranian proxies that Iran is fighting. And on any other day, Carmel, we probably would have started by asking you about what happened in Yemen last night. The United States carried out a series of airstrikes using B-2 bombers that flew halfway around the world to drop bunker-busting bombs to destroy underground weapons facilities in areas of Yemen that have been put there by Houthi rebels. To what extent was that a message to Tehran, the projection of power that we can reach things underground?
Oh, this was a very loud and clear message to Tehran. And it's not just a message to Tehran about the military capability of the U.S. or, frankly, any of the other maneuvers by Israel. But what you're really seeing is that even when there are these moments of tension between the United States and Israel that may be happening in backroom negotiations, when it comes to the battlefield, these two countries are going to be in absolute lockstep. They see the threat posed by Iran to the region, and the United States is going to stand behind Israel. And so in taking on Houthi rebels, the U.S. is sending a message to Iran that it is going to be there alongside the Israelis, no matter what Iran does.